Welcome to Stifel's Sightlines podcast, focusing each week on a topic or two important to investors. Greetings and welcome to the Sightlines podcast. This is Michael O'Keefe, Stifel's Chief Investment Officer. I want to get into the situation in the Middle East, starting with just a comment and an invitation really to check out. If you go to stifelinsights.com, you can find on that webpage a report we call our Geopolitical Risk Dashboard. This is an effort that the team goes through to identify risks and assess the likelihood of these risks as in terms of whether they might happen and the potential market volatility. And we sort of have this window of a 3 to 5 year look. And in that report, we have, we identify a bunch of different risks. One, we labeled the concept of a Middle East war, which is intended to describe a prolonged Israel-Iran conflict that could escalate to involve the U.S. And unfortunately, that may now be unfolding. So that's what I want to get into in this episode. It's partly what I want to do is go back and provide some context. If we go back to the late 60s, early 70s, there was a nuclear non-proliferation treaty that Iran ratified back then. It's known that they violated those terms in the early 2000s. In 2015, there was the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, but even President Trump withdrew from that, the U.S., and then Iran started breaching commitments related to that agreement in 2019. Now, obviously, things like the terrorist attacks, the Hamas invasion of Israel is playing into this. And more broadly, I would say that Israel has viewed and communicated that they view Iran to be an existential threat as it relates to Iran's nuclear ambitions. And so it's notable anyway that as the U.S. was talking at least about engaging with Iran to try to strike a new and revised nuclear deal, basically Israel decided to strike before those talks could happen. And the strikes were intended and have really looked to degrade the nuclear program in Iran, eliminate military leadership, and weaken missile capabilities. Now, Iran has launched counterstrikes that have been not entirely, but mostly ineffective. And there's risk really of greater escalation. On one hand, one could imagine Iran, and they've hinted at using regional proxies like the Houthis to expand the conflict. And that would, destabilize the broader Middle East and certainly invite U.S. involvement. But there's already talk of U.S. involvement that the administration, Trump administration, is considering engaging here. And so this is obviously basically a war. The question is going to be, how long does it go? Can we find a path to peace? And so, we want to think about that from a human perspective, but then of course, we want to look at things from a market perspective. And, an anchor to the focus and the worries in a way are oil markets. Oil jumped 7% last Friday as the conflict began, for example. Equity markets were off a little bit. They were actually rebounded on Monday and then recovered, recording on today, Tuesday. But back to oil, basically 30% of the world's oil shipped by tanker passes through the Strait of Hormuz every day. And so that is a sort of a geographic area that, with conflict could end up closing, and that would be very destabilizing for the world's oil supply. And so that's the kind of thing that folks are focusing on as it relates to trying to understand the risks here. And the risks are obviously disruption, maybe a slower economy, maybe a more subdued or negative economic growth globally. And then if oil prices go up, that's really sort of a natural feeder into higher inflation. So there's been all this work to try to bring inflation down. But if oil prices really start to climb, that will be a real headwind to helping with inflation. So again, we've had equity market volatility. and it relates in part to the worries about inflation, the economy, et cetera. Now, there recently, coincidentally, was the G7 meeting where leaders have called for de-escalation and emphasized the hope, if you will, or need for diplomacy. And our president, Donald Trump, has signaled a desire to be more deeply involved, and in his typical way, pretty aggressive in his communication and comments about Iran, and sort of a consideration of the U.S. getting involved. And so it's a fast-changing situation. We'll see, obviously, where it goes. And in some ways, for Stifel, we have that sort of medium-term look through the geopolitical risk dashboard. But when things actually look like they're unfolding, then we kind of shift gears and go a little bit harder, a little bit deeper. So we'll obviously stay very close and be communicating pretty actively about the situation with an eye towards hopefully things stabilizing, hopefully peace, but especially as well, the oil markets remaining stable and the region remaining stable and so forth. And so, again, much more to analyze and much more to talk about as we look forward. So listen, that's the sort of unfortunate update for this episode. Really appreciate you taking the time to listen, and we will catch you on the next one. Thanks again for listening to Stifel's Sightlines. Be sure to subscribe wherever you're listening to automatically receive each week's podcast in your feed.